The cold in Prague that winter wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical presence. It seeped through the thickest coats, crept under doorways, and settled deep in the marrow of your bones. For me, Liam O'Connell, an American photographer who had traded the predictable sunshine of California for the gothic gloom of Bohemia, the cold was both my tormentor and my muse. I had come here to escape the ghost of a smile, the echo of a laugh, the suffocating sympathy of friends who didn't know what else to say after the accident. I came to Prague to feel something other than grief, and in its ancient, melancholy beauty, I found a worthy distraction. My apartment was in Mala Strana, the lesser town, a labyrinth of cobblestone streets nestled in the shadow of Prague Castle. The building itself was a relic, a stoic old beast that had weathered centuries of kings, wars, and revolutions. Its facade was a beautiful, crumbling tapestry of faded pastels, ornate stucco, and the grime of ages. The rent was a joke, a figure so low it made my friends back in the States question if I was living in a closet. In hindsight, they weren't far off. The landlord, a man named Mr. Vondrasek, was as much a fixture of the building as the creaking floorboards. He was a tall, skeletal figure with eyes the color of a winter sky and skin like stretched parchment. When he handed me the heavy, ornate iron key, his fingers, cold and dry, brushed against mine for a moment too long. "The building has character," he'd said, his English precise but heavy with a Czech accent that made the words sound like they were being chipped from stone. "It breathes. It remembers. You will get used to its ways." At the time, I thought it was charming, a poetic flourish from a man who had spent his entire life in a city steeped in folklore. I didn't understand that he was giving me a warning. The apartment itself was a study in beautiful decay. High, vaulted ceilings webbed with fine cracks, towering windows that let in a weak, pearly light, and hardwood floors that sang arias of groans and sighs with every step. The centerpiece was a magnificent, non-functional kaklova kamna, a huge ceramic stove covered in intricate green tiles, standing in the corner of the living room like a forgotten altar, but there was one feature that was immediately off: the bedroom closet. In an apartment defined by its grand, inefficient use of space, the closet was an anomaly. It was located in the main bedroom, a long, narrow room with a single large window overlooking a quiet, perpetually damp courtyard. The closet was set into the far wall, and it was deep. Unnervingly deep. When I first opened it, a wave of musty, stagnant air washed over me. I could stretch my arms out fully and still not touch the back wall. It was a dark, cavernous space that seemed to defy the building's architectural logic. Plenty of storage, Mr. Vondrasek had noted, a thin, bloodless smile touching his lips. "For all your things." I didn't have many things, but I was grateful for the space. I pushed my empty suitcases to the back, hung up my few shirts and jackets, and promptly tried to forget about the yawning darkness behind the door. For the first month, life was a peaceful, melancholic routine. I spent my days wandering the city, my camera a permanent extension of my arm. I captured the skeletal trees on Petrin Hill, the mournful gaze of the statues on the Charles Bridge, the way the fog would roll off the Vltava River and swallow the city whole. At night, I would sit in my apartment, the radiator hissing and clanking, and listen to the building's symphony. The groaning pipes, the sighing of the wind in the eaves, the distant, muffled footsteps from the apartment above. These were the sounds of an old building settling, the sounds Mr. Vondrasek had mentioned. They were the sounds of history, and they were, for a time, comforting. Then, the other sounds began. It started subtly, a whisper beneath the building's usual chorus. A faint scratching sound. At first, I dismissed it as mice. An old building in a European capital. It was to be expected. I bought a few traps from a small hardware store where the owner spoke no English, and I spoke no Czech. We communicated through gestures and sympathetic smiles. I set the traps in the kitchen and along the baseboards in the living room, baiting them with a bit of cheese. They remained untouched. Day after day, the cheese sat there, a lonely offering to rodents that apparently had no interest in it. Yet, the scratching continued. It wasn't the frantic, skittering sound of a mouse. This was slower, more deliberate. It had a rhythm. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. And it wasn't coming from the kitchen or the baseboards. It was coming from the bedroom. Specifically, from the wall with the closet that I tried to ignore it. I turned up the volume on my music, wore headphones while I edited photos, and drank an extra glass of Becherovka before bed, hoping the herbal liqueur would grant me a dreamless sleep. But the sound seemed to find its way through, a persistent, unnerving whisper in the quiet of the night. One evening, I was talking to my friend Chloe on a video call. She was another American expat, a freelance writer who had been in Prague for 3 years and had adopted the city's cynical, no-nonsense attitude. "It's just rats, Liam," she said, her face pixelated on my laptop screen. "Big, old-world, bubonic plague-carrying rats. You need to call Vondrasek. Make him deal with it. That's what you pay rent for." "I did," I sighed, running a hand through my already messy hair. "He just gave me this weird, cryptic speech about how the house has its own life and told me to be patient." Chloe rolled her eyes. "Of course he did. He probably is the rat. Just get some poison. Or a cat. A big, mean one." After the call, I pressed my ear against the wall next to the closet door. The scratching was there, faint but undeniable. It sounded like a long fingernail being dragged slowly across wood. My skin prickled. It wasn't an animal sound. It couldn't be. That night, I was jolted from a shallow, restless sleep by a new sound. Knock. That it was a single, hard rap. It was so loud, so sharp, it felt like it had happened right beside my bed. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was pitch black, the weak moonlight filtered out by the thick clouds. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Just the familiar groan of the pipes and the distant wail of a siren that I convinced myself I had dreamed it. A stress dream. My grief manifesting in new, creative ways. I lay back down, my body tense, and stared at the ceiling until the first gray light of dawn crept into the room. It happened again the next night. This time, it was 2 knocks. Knock. Knock, louder, more insistent. And I was definitely awake. I checked my phone. 3:17 a.m. The time was seared into my brain. I got out of bed, my feet cold on the wooden floor, and crept towards the bedroom door, thinking maybe it was someone in the hallway. I peered through the peephole. The hall was empty, lit by a single, flickering bulb that cast long, dancing shadows. The sound was coming from inside my apartment. From the closet wall. The third night, I was waiting for it. I sat in the living room, a lamp on, a heavy photography tripod clutched in my hand like a weapon. The digital clock on my laptop ticked past 3:16. The silence in the apartment was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to smother all other sounds. At exactly 3:17 a.m., it came. Knock. 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 3 slow, deliberate, perfectly spaced knocks. They didn't sound like a house settling. They sounded like a summons. Like someone was on the other side of that wall, patiently, insistently, demanding to be let in. My blood ran cold. This wasn't pipes. This wasn't the building breathing. This was something else. Something wrong. The nightly ritual of the 3 knocks became the new, terrifying metronome of my life. Every night, 3:17 a.m. No more, no less. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I started sleeping on the lumpy sofa in the living room, leaving the bedroom door closed, as if that could contain the sound. It didn't. The knock seemed to travel through the very frame of the building, vibrating up through the floor, a phantom heartbeat that found me wherever I tried to hide that my work suffered. My hands trembled so much I could barely hold my camera steady. The beautiful melancholy of Prague now seemed sinister. The gargoyles on the cathedrals looked less like protectors and more like leering demons. The narrow, winding streets felt like they were actively trying to trap me. That I called Mr. Vondrasek again. My voice was sharp with exhaustion and fear. The knocking won't stop, I said, foregoing any pleasantries. Every night. It's coming from the bedroom wall. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear his slow, steady breathing. Mr. O'Connell, he said finally, his voice unnervingly calm. Old houses have many voices. They speak of the past. Perhaps you are just not used to listening. This isn't a voice, it's a pattern. I nearly shouted. 3 knocks. Every single night at the same time. That's not a house settling. Time is a circle, Mr. O'Connell. Things repeat, he said, and the line went dead. That I was on my own, the police wouldn't take me seriously. A noise complaint? In a building this old? They told me it was a civil matter, something to be handled with the landlord. Chloe tried to be supportive, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She thought I was cracking under the strain of my grief, my imagination running wild in a foreign city. Maybe you should see someone, Liam, she suggested gently one afternoon over coffee.
Just to talk. It's been a tough year. I knew she meant well, but her words felt like a betrayal. I wasn't crazy. The knocking was real. The scratching was real. That night, fueled by a potent combination of desperation and caffeine, I decided to confront the source. The closet. With a flashlight clenched in my teeth, I started emptying it. My suitcases, my clothes, the box of old photo equipment I never used. I piled everything in the middle of the bedroom floor until the closet was completely bare. The air inside was colder than the rest of the room, and the musty smell was stronger now, mingled with something else. A faint, sour, coppery scent, like old pennies that I ran my hands over the walls. They were solid plaster, cold and unyielding. But the back wall, it was different. The original prompt I'd read online, the one that now felt like a prophecy, had mentioned plywood. This wasn't plywood. It was something else. It was plaster, yes, but it felt wrong. The texture was smoother, the color a slightly different shade of off-white. As if it had been repainted more recently than the rest of the apartment, I knocked on it with my knuckles. The side walls produced a dull, solid thud. The back wall, however, returned a hollow, resonant thump, and my heart leaped into my throat. There was a space back there that I pressed my hands against the center of the wall, pushing with all my weight. Nothing. I scanned the edges, looking for a seam, a crack, anything. The wall was flush with the floor and ceiling, sealed perfectly. It looked like it had always been there. But it hadn't. I knew my eyes fell on the baseboard. It was old, ornate wood, matching the rest of the apartment. But at the bottom of the back wall, a small section, no more than a few inches long, didn't quite line up. The wood grain was different. The varnish was a shade darker. I raced to the kitchen and returned with a butter knife. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I wedged the tip of the knife into the tiny seam and pried. The wood groaned in protest. With a final, splintering crack, the small section of baseboard came loose. Behind it, there was no wall. There was only darkness. And from that darkness, a draft of impossibly cold, foul-smelling air flowed out, washing over me. It smelled of dust, of damp earth, and of something else. Something metallic and vaguely sweet. The smell of old blood. I shone my flashlight into the opening. It revealed a thin, dark gap. The back wall wasn't a wall at all. It was a panel, a facade, expertly plastered and painted to hide its true nature. For a long moment, I just stared, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The scratching, the knocking, Mr. Vondrasek's cryptic words. It all coalesced into a single, terrifying realization. I was not alone in this apartment, and whatever else was here with me was on the other side of that wall. The rational part of my brain, the part that still clung to sanity, screamed at me to put the baseboard back, to pack my bags, to run and never look back. But another part, a darker, more reckless part, a part born of grief and rage and a desperate need for answers, took over. I needed to know. I needed to see what was making the sounds that had haunted my nights. I found a crowbar in the small toolkit I kept under the sink. Felt heavy and cold in my hands. I returned to the closet, took a deep, shuddering breath, and jammed the tip of the crowbar into the gap I had created. The sound of the plaster cracking was like a gunshot in the silent apartment. It was a point of no return. With every heave, my fear battled with a morbid, all-consuming curiosity. The panel resisted, held in place by more than just plaster. It felt like it was being held from the other side. With a final, desperate wrench, the seal broke. A large section of the false wall tore away, crumbling to the floor in a cloud of white dust that swirled in my flashlight beam like angry spirits. The smell that hit me was a physical blow. It was a thick, complex stench of decay, not of a body, but of place. It was the smell of stagnant air, of sweat-soaked fear, of rust, and that same sickly sweet coppery tang. Now so strong it made me gag that I held my breath and pointed the flashlight into the abyss that it wasn't a crawl space. It was a room, a small, windowless, stone-walled chamber, no bigger than a large pantry. It was a hidden wound in the heart of the building, a space that had no right to exist. The air was heavy and dead. The silence within was profound, a stark contrast to the noises that had emanated from my flashlight beam trembled as it moved across the scene, revealing details in horrifying succession. In the center of the room, bolted directly to the stone floor, was a single chair. It was a brutalist piece of furniture, made of dark, stained wood and rusted iron. Thick leather straps, cracked and stiff with age, were attached to the arms and legs, their buckles tarnished but intact. The leather was stained with dark, almost black patches. Next to the chair was a small, rickety wooden table. On it lay a collection of instruments that made my stomach churn. Not surgical tools, they were too crude for that. Pliers of various sizes, a small, rusty handsaw with fine teeth, a set of metal picks and probes, and a large, archaic-looking syringe with a thick, wicked-looking needle, a dark, viscous residue still clinging to the inside of the glass. Light drifted from the table to the walls, and my breath caught in my chest. The walls were covered in writing, from floor to ceiling. Every inch of the cold stone was a canvas of desperation. Names, hundreds of them. They were scratched, gouged, and clawed into the stone. Some were neat, carefully etched as if by a nail. Others were a frantic, overlapping scrawl, the work of someone in the final throes of terror. The sheer volume was staggering. It was a ledger of suffering, a testament to decades of silent screams. I saw names in different languages, German, Russian, and mostly Czech. I saw dates next to some of them: 1943, 1958, 1972, 1985. A timeline of horror that spanned the Nazi occupation, the Soviet era, and beyond. This room had been in use for a very, very long time. Light fell upon a section of the wall near the chair. Here, the scratches were different. They were fresher. The stone dust beneath them was still pale, not yet darkened by age and grime, and there, among the newer names, I saw one that made the blood freeze in my veins: Aneta Novikova. The name was gouged into the wall with a ferocity that had shattered the writer's fingernails. I could see the faint, dark smears of dried blood in the grooves of the letters. Below the name was a single, freshly scratched word: Sarah. Yesterday. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The room, which had been silent, suddenly felt deafeningly loud. I could almost hear the echoes of the pain that had soaked into its very stones. The scratching I had heard, it wasn't a ghost. It was her, Aneta. She had been on the other side of that wall, scratching, knocking, trying to get out, while I lay in my bed, annoyed by the noise. The thought was a physical blow. I turned and scrambled out of the closet, tripping over the rubble of the broken wall, gasping for air that wasn't thick with the stench of death and despair. I slammed the bedroom door shut, my back against it, as if that could contain the horror I had just unleashed at him. My hands shook so violently I could barely unlock my phone. I dialed 112, the European emergency number. Policy prosum, I gasped, my voice a raw whisper. Police, my apartment, I found something. The arrival of the policy was a surreal intrusion of the modern world into the timeless horror of my apartment. 2 officers, a man and a woman, arrived first. They were young, professional, and their faces were masks of bored skepticism as I, a babbling, terrified American, tried to explain what I had found. They followed me into the bedroom, their expressions shifting to shock as they saw the hole in the wall and the dark space beyond. They didn't enter the room. They secured the apartment, told me not to touch anything, and called for detectives. An hour later, Inspector Dvorak arrived. He was the antithesis of the first 2 officers. He was a man in his late 50s, with a weary, lived-in face, a rumpled trench coat, and eyes that had seen far too much. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, his gaze missing nothing. He listened to my frantic story without interruption, his expression unreadable. He and a forensics team spent hours in the hidden room. I sat on the lumpy sofa in my living room, wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had given me, feeling like a ghost in my own home. I could hear the murmur of their voices, the flash of cameras, the clink of metal tools. Finally, Dvorak emerged. He sat down in the armchair opposite me, letting out a heavy sigh. Mr. O'Connell, he began, his voice raspy. This is a very unusual situation. The names? I said, my voice trembling. Did you see the names? Aneta Novikova. She wrote yesterday. Dvorak nodded slowly. We saw the names. We are running them through our databases, cross-referencing with missing persons reports going back decades. It will take time. He paused, looking at me intently. But there is a problem. We have checked the building's registry, the city's records. There is no official tenant named Aneta Novikova registered at this address. According to the paperwork, the previous tenant was an elderly man who died of natural causes 6 months ago. Before him, a student from Germany. No women, no Aneta. That's impossible, I insisted. Her name is on the wall. It's fresh. I am not saying you are wrong,
Dvorak said, raising a placating hand. I am telling you what the official records say. We also spoke to your landlord, Mr. Vondrasek. My blood ran cold. What did he say? He claims to know nothing about a hidden room. He says you have vandalized his property. He was very insistent on that point. He says the previous tenant never complained of any noises. Dvorak's eyes narrowed slightly. He is an old man. His family has owned this building since it was constructed. They are well known. The implication was clear. The Vondrasek family had deep roots, and deep roots could bury many secrets. The police left as the sun was rising, casting a sickly gray light over the city. They had taken samples, photographs, and my statement. The room was sealed with police tape. Dvorak gave me his card and told me not to leave Prague. We will be in touch, Mr. O'Connell, he said, his expression grim. Try to get some rest. Rest was impossible. The image of the chair, the tools, the wall of names, was burned into my mind. I couldn't stay in the apartment. The air itself felt poisoned. I called Chloe, my voice cracking. Liam. What's wrong? You sound awful. Can I stay with you? I asked, the words tumbling out. Just for a night or two. I can't be here. I'll explain everything. She didn't hesitate. Of course. Come over now. I packed a small bag with my laptop, my camera, and a change of clothes. As I was about to leave, I paused at the bedroom door. The police tape was a stark yellow slash against the dark wood. I could feel the cold radiating from the room, a palpable entity that I fled, not looking back. Chloe's apartment was in Vinohrady, a neighborhood of grand Art Nouveau buildings and leafy parks. It was bright, modern, and blessedly free of history. As I sat at her kitchen table, recounting the story, I saw her initial skepticism melt away, replaced by wide-eyed horror. "Oh my God, Liam," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. I don't even have words. She made me tea, forced me to eat some toast, and set me up on the pull-out sofa in her living room. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of safety. The exhaustion was bone-deep, a crushing weight that finally pulled me under. I fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep that I was woken by a sound. My eyes snapped open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the digital clock on the cable box. 3:17 a.m. Chloe's cat, a sleek black creature named Kafka, was standing on my chest, its back arched, its fur standing on end. It was staring at the apartment door, a low, guttural hiss escaping its throat, and then I heard it, from the other side of Chloe's front door, tap, 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 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not loud. Barely audible. But they were there. My heart stopped. A wave of ice-cold terror washed over me, more potent and paralyzing than anything I had felt before that I had opened the door. I had broken the seal. And whatever had been in that room, trapped for generations, it wasn't in the room anymore. It had followed me, the shadow in the alcove. For a long moment, I lay frozen on the sofa, a statue carved from pure terror. My own heartbeat was a frantic drum against the suffocating silence that followed the 3 knocks. Kafka, the cat, was still a rigid ball of muscle on my chest, his hiss having subsided into a low, rumbling growl directed at the door. "Did you hear that?" a voice whispered from the darkness of the living room. It was Chloe. She was standing in the doorway of her bedroom, a silhouette against the faint light from the hall. Yes, I managed to breathe out, the word feeling like broken glass in my throat. The knocks had not been loud. They were subtle, almost polite. A sound that could easily be dismissed as a branch tapping a window or a neighbor stumbling home late. But we both knew what it was. It was the same precise, patient rhythm. The same unholy summons. It had found me. It had crossed the city, tracked me to this bright, modern apartment, and was now standing on the other side of the door. "Who is it?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling but laced with a defiant anger. "It's 3 in the morning. Don't," I said, my voice sharp with panic. "Don't open it." I carefully lifted the cat off my chest and slid off the sofa, my bare feet silent on the cool floor. Together, Chloe and I crept towards the door. My eyes were locked on the peephole, a tiny circle of brass that suddenly felt like the lens of a malevolent god. I was terrified of what I might see, but the thought of not knowing was even worse. Taking a shuddering breath, I pressed my eye to the hole. The hallway was empty. The same flickering overhead light cast the same dancing shadows. There was no one there. No stooped figure, no shadowy presence. Nothing. "There's no one there," I whispered, pulling back. "But we heard it," Chloe insisted. We both heard it. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of the pre-dawn trams. The presence, whatever it was, had announced itself and vanished, leaving behind a thick residue of fear that clung to the air like smoke that we didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We sat in the kitchen with every light on, drinking tea we didn't taste, talking in hushed, frantic tones. Chloe had finally crossed the threshold from concerned friend to terrified believer. The haunting was no longer my private burden, it had knocked on her door, too. "This is insane," she said, running her hands through her hair for the 10th time. "It can't be real. How did it find you?" "I don't know," I said, staring at the steam rising from my mug. It's tethered to me now. When I broke open that wall, I didn't just let it out. I think I invited it in." The next day, I called Inspector Dvorak. I told him about the knocking at Chloe's apartment. I expected dismissal, perhaps even a suggestion that I seek psychiatric help. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. "Mr. O'Connell," he said finally, his voice heavy with weariness. "My team finished the preliminary forensic analysis of the room. We found traces of blood from dozens of different individuals, some of it decades old. We found skin cells under the fingernails of a body discovered in the Vltava 2 days ago. A young woman. Her name was Aneta Novikova." I squeezed my eyes shut. So I was right. She was in there. Yes. But here is where it becomes difficult. The coroner's report states her time of death was at least 72 hours before her body was found. Which means she was already dead when you heard her scratching her name into the wall. The phone felt slick in my hand. That's not possible. I heard her. I heard her knocking. I am a policeman, Mr. O'Connell. I deal in facts and evidence, Dvorak said, though his voice lacked conviction. The facts are telling me one story, and you are telling me another. Officially, the investigation is focused on the Vondrasek family. We are looking into their history, their finances. But unofficially, I would advise you to be very careful. This city is old. Some stories are more than just stories." He hung up, leaving me in a silence that was more terrifying than any noise. Aneta had been dead. The scratching, the knocking from inside the room, it had been an echo, a memory replaying itself. Or it had been the entity itself, performing its gruesome theater for my benefit. The haunting was no longer confined to 3:17 a.m. It had begun to bleed into my waking life, subtle intrusions that were designed to unravel my sanity. I started seeing things in the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement, a tall, thin shadow that would vanish the moment I turned to face it. I would hear whispers on the edge of hearing, faint and sibilant, like the rustling of dry leaves, but there was never anyone there. The worst incident happened 2 days after the knocking at Chloe's door. I was in the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to wash away the exhaustion that had become my permanent state. I looked up, and my heart seized in my chest. For a split second, reflected in the mirror behind my own tired image, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, shrouded in what looked like a dark, heavy coat. I couldn't see a face, only a pale, indistinct blur where a head should be. It was standing just behind my left shoulder, one hand slightly raised, as if about to rest on me. That I yelled and spun around, stumbling back against the wall. The bathroom was empty, that I was alone, but the reflection, it was so clear, so real. The terror was so absolute it left me breathless and shaking. I stared at my own reflection, at the empty space behind me, my mind screaming. It was toying with me. It wanted me to know that it could be anywhere, anytime. That there was no safe place. Chloe found me sitting on the bathroom floor, my head in my hands. When I told her what I saw, she didn't doubt me. Her face was pale. "Okay," she said, her voice firm. "That's it. The police can't help us. Vondrasek is a dead end. We need a different kind of help. This is Prague. People here know about things like this." Chloe, being a writer, had a network of contacts that extended into the city's more obscure corners. She spent the day making calls, speaking in rapid, hushed Czech. She was looking for someone her contacts referred to only as Pani Savova, Mrs. Owl. She was not a priest or a psychic, but something else entirely, a folklorist and an oral historian who specialized in the dark geography of Prague, the stories that cling to certain buildings and streets like a persistent stain. That we were given an address in the old Jewish quarter, a neighborhood of narrow alleys and somber synagogues. Pani Savova lived on the top floor of a creaking building that leaned against its neighbor for support. The air in the stairwell was tea. The air in the stairwell was thick with the smell of old paper, dried herbs, and dust. The woman who opened the door was ancient. She was small and bird-like, wrapped in a multitude of shawls despite the stuffy heat of her apartment. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and her eyes, behind thick spectacles, were a startlingly bright, intelligent blue. They seemed to see right through me. "You are the American," she said, her voice a dry rustle. It was a statement, not a question. "The one from the house in Mala Strana. Come in. The spirits of that place are loud, and they have followed you." Her apartment was a single, cavernous room, crammed from floor to ceiling with books. They were piled on shelves, stacked on the floor, overflowing from tables. A small path snaked between the towers of paper. She led us to a small clearing where 2 chairs and a small table waited, as if she had been expecting us. That I told her everything. The deep closet, the scratching, the 3 knocks at 3:17 a.m., the hidden room, the chair, the names on the wall, Mr. Vondrasek, Inspector Dvorak's call, the knocking at Chloe's door, the figure in the mirror. She listened without a single interruption, her blue eyes fixed on my face. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "The Vondrasek house," she said, her voice low. "It has been a place of sorrow for a very long time. It does not just have a ghost, Mr. O'Connell. It has a keeper. A collector." "A collector?" I asked. "The man who built that house in the 17th century, a man named Yarmir Vondrasek, was not just a wealthy merchant. He was an alchemist, obsessed with life and death. He did not seek to turn lead into gold, but to capture the final essence of a life, the last breath, the final spark of terror, of despair. He believed this energy could be harvested, stored. He believed it could grant him a form of persistence." She pointed a bony finger at me. "The room you found was his laboratory. The chair was his instrument. Through the centuries, his descendants have continued his work. Not with alchemy, perhaps, but with a simple, brutal cruelty. They are the keepers of the house, and the house, in turn, sustains them. They bring victims to that room, and the entity that their ancestor created or summoned, it feeds. It collects." My blood ran cold. "So Vondrasek, he's a part of it?" "He is the current keeper," she confirmed. "This entity, it is bound to the room, but it is also a creature of ritual and habit. The knocking, the 3 knocks, that is the summons. It is the signal that a new collection is about to begin. It is an announcement. When you heard it, you were hearing the echo of Aneta Novakova's final hours. When you broke down the wall, you disrupted a cycle that has been unbroken for centuries. You have drawn its attention in a way no one has before. It is not just an echo now. It is focused on you. How do I stop it?" I pleaded. "It followed me. I saw it in my apartment." Pani Savova leaned forward, her eyes intense. "You cannot fight it head-on. It is too old, too strong. You must first learn its rules. You must show it a sign of respect, an acknowledgement of its power. You must adopt its ritual to protect yourself." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "From now on," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "before you enter any room, any enclosed space, you must knock 3 times. Tap. 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 You must announce your presence to the unseen world. You are showing it that you know it is there. It is a small thing, but rituals have power. It may keep the worst of it at bay. For a time. The advice was insane. A folk remedy for a supernatural cancer. But looking into the old woman's dead serious eyes, I knew I had no other choice. There is one more thing, she said as we were leaving. The entity is a mimic. It learns. Be careful what you say. Be careful what you invite in. The walk back to Chloe's apartment was a blur. Pani Savova's words echoed in my head. A keeper. A collector. Adopt its ritual. It was the stuff of nightmares, but it was the only explanation that fit the impossible facts. That evening, I stood before the door to the guest bedroom where I was sleeping. My hand was raised, trembling. This felt ridiculous. I was a rational person. A photographer from California. I didn't believe in curses and ancient entities. But then I remembered the figure in the mirror, the cold dread that followed the knock. My knuckles rapped against the wood. Tap. 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 The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet apartment. I waited, my heart pounding. Nothing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and opened the door. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. It had done nothing. Of course, it had done nothing, but I did it again before entering the bathroom. And again before re-entering the living room. It became a nervous, compulsive habit, a small prayer against the darkness. That night, I had a dream. I was in the chair. The cold stone of the hidden room surrounded me. The leather straps were tight against my wrists and ankles, biting into my skin. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. A figure stood over me, the same tall, gaunt shape from the mirror. It leaned down, and for the first time, I saw its face. It was Mr. Vondrasek, but his eyes were hollow sockets of pure darkness, and his thin smile was stretched into a grotesque rictus. He held the rusted, archaic syringe in his hand. The house remembers, he whispered, his voice a chorus of all the whispers I had been hearing. And now, it will collect you. I woke up with a strangled cry, drenched in sweat. I sat up, gasping for air, and looked down at my arms. There, on my wrists, were faint, red marks. The distinct, chafed lines of straps that had been pulled too tight that I scrambled out of bed, my mind reeling. It wasn't just a dream. It was touching me. Hurting me that I stumbled into the living room, needing the light, needing to see Chloe, to prove I wasn't alone. And then I remembered Pani Savova's final warning. The entity is a mimic. It learns that an idea, born of pure, distilled terror, took root in my mind. A test. I had to know that. I walked back to the closed bedroom door. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely form a fist. I took a deep breath. Tap. 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 That I knocked on the door of the empty room. That I leaned my head close to the wood, my ear pressed against the cool surface. I waited for the familiar, comforting silence. Hello. I whispered, my voice cracking. Is anyone there? For a second, there was nothing. And then, from the other side of the door, from inside the empty, silent room, a voice answered. That it was a dry, rasping sound, like stones grinding together. A voice that was ancient and full of dust and malice. And it spoke a single word. Stopped. Enter. The shadow in the alcove. The single word, stopped, hung in the air between me and the door, a bridge of sound across a chasm of pure terror. It was not a human voice. It was the sound of gravestones grinding together, of dry bones rattling in a forgotten crypt. It was the voice of the room, of the house, of the ancient malice that had been waiting patiently in the dark. That I recoiled from the door as if it were white-hot, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. A strangled gasp escaped my lips, a sound utterly devoid of courage. My mind, already frayed, simply snapped. The test had been a catastrophic success. I had knocked, I had asked, and something had answered. Pani Savova's warning about the mimic had been a terrifying understatement. This thing didn't just learn, it participated. It was playing a game, and I had just learned a new, horrific rule. Chloe came running from the kitchen, a tea towel still in her hand. Liam. What is it? What happened? She saw me sprawled on the floor, my eyes wide with a terror that was beyond words, my finger pointing shakily at the closed bedroom door. It answered, I whispered, the words barely audible. I knocked, and it answered me. The color drained from her face. She stared at the door, no longer just a piece of wood but a gateway, a barrier between our fragile reality and the abyss that now knew our names. She didn't need to ask what I meant. The fear radiating from me was answer enough. Okay, she said, her voice a tight wire of forced calm. Okay. We're not staying here tonight. Not another second. She grabbed my arm and hauled me to my feet. We didn't pack. We didn't even grab our coats. Chloe snatched her keys and her purse from the counter, and we fled the apartment, slamming the door shut behind us, leaving the lights on and the unseen occupant to its silent vigil in the empty room. That we burst out into the cold Prague night, the air a shocking, painful slap to my lungs. We ran. We ran without direction, our footsteps echoing on the cobblestones of Vinohrady, two frantic figures under the indifferent gaze of the streetlights. We ended up at an all-night hotel near the main train station, a soulless, transient place of beige walls and generic art. It was perfect. It had no history, no memory that I and the sterile anonymity of the hotel room. The terror began to recede, replaced by a shaking, bone-deep exhaustion. It's a trap, I said, pacing the small room while Chloe sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself. The knocking ritual. Pani Savova said it was for protection, but it's not. It's an invitation. It's a dialogue. What are we going to do, Liam? Chloe asked, her voice small. We can't just keep running from hotel to hotel. It followed you from Mala Strana to my apartment. It will find you here. She was right. I felt like an animal with a tracking collar, a signal pulsing out into the darkness, telling the hunter exactly where I was. The entity wasn't just tethered to me, it was woven into the fabric of my fear. The knocking ritual, my only defense, was now my greatest vulnerability. To not knock was to leave myself open to its random incursions, the figure in the mirror, the touch in my sleep. But to knock was to engage with it, to acknowledge it, to invite it to speak from the other side of the door. I was trapped between two unbearable choices. We stayed in the hotel for 2 days, living in a sleepless haze. I called Inspector Dvorak and told him what happened. He sounded tired, burdened. Mr. O'Connell, we have brought Mr. Vondrasek in for questioning multiple times, he said. He is a rock. He denies everything. He has lawyers, influential friends. He claims you are a disturbed young man, traumatized by a personal loss, who has vandalized his property and is now suffering from delusions. Without more concrete evidence, my hands are tied. The evidence is in that room. I yelled into the phone. The evidence answered me from behind a door. I believe you, Dvorak said, and the quiet sincerity in his voice stunned me into silence. I believe something is happening to you. But the law has no framework for a voice in an empty room. I am having my researchers dig into the Vondrasek family history, into the folklore surrounding that part of the city. But it takes time. For now, stay away from that apartment. Stay with your friend. Be careful. Being careful felt like a useless platitude. The haunting had become more insidious, more personal. It had moved beyond simple frights into a campaign of psychological warfare. One afternoon, While Chloe was in the shower, I heard her voice call my name from the hotel room's main living area. Liam? Can you grab my towel? I forgot it. It was her voice, perfect in every inflection. I grabbed a towel and walked to the bathroom door. My hand was raised to knock, the ritual now an automatic, twitching reflex, when the shower inside the bathroom shut off. A second later, the real Chloe opened the door, wrapped in a different towel. "What are you doing?" she asked, seeing the towel in my hand. You just asked me for this," I stammered. She stared at me, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "Liam," she said slowly. I didn't say a word. The entity was mimicking her now. It was trying to drive a wedge of paranoia between us, to isolate me completely. The whispers I used to hear at the edge of my hearing became clearer. They would murmur my name when I was alone, or sometimes, they would whisper a single, chilling word, Spiritel. The collector, the physical manifestations grew bolder. A book sliding off a table with no one near it. The television turning on by itself, always to a channel of static, the white noise sounding like 1,000 tormented whispers. One night, I woke up to find every drawer and cabinet in our hotel room wide open, their contents undisturbed, a silent, orderly violation of our space that we were living on a knife's edge, starting at every sound, scrutinizing every shadow. The vibrant, beautiful city outside the hotel window felt like a distant planet. Our world had shrunk to the size of our fear. On the third day, I couldn't stand the confinement any longer. I felt like if I stayed in that beige room for one more minute, I would lose what was left of my mind. Chloe was asleep, finally succumbing to sheer exhaustion. I needed to walk. I needed to feel the cold air, to see other people, to pretend for just an hour that my life was normal, that I performed the knocking ritual on the hotel room door before leaving, my heart pounding as I waited for a response that thankfully never came. I wandered aimlessly, letting my feet carry me away from the tourist-clogged arteries of the city center and into the quieter, more authentic neighborhoods that I found myself in, a part of Zizkov I'd never been to, a district of working-class apartment blocks and gritty, unpretentious pubs. Tucked between a butcher's shop and a pharmacy was a small, cluttered antique store, a Star is at Nosti. The windows were grimy, packed with dusty porcelain, tarnished silver, and old, forgotten paintings. Normally, I would have walked right by. But something drew me to it. A feeling. A strange pull, like a faint, invisible thread tugging at my chest. On impulse, I pushed open the heavy wooden door, a small bell announcing my arrival with a cheerful, incongruous jingle. The shop was a dragon's hoard of lost time. Every surface was covered in the detritus of other people's lives. The air smelled of old wood, beeswax, and decay. An elderly man with a magnificent white beard looked up from behind a counter piled high with books. He nodded at me but said nothing, allowing me to browse in peace. That I drifted through the narrow aisles, my fingers ghosting over cracked leather-bound books and cold brass instruments. And then I saw it, sitting on a low shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of yellowed newspapers, was a small wooden box. It was made of a dark, almost black wood, and its surface was covered in intricate, swirling carvings that were not quite floral, not quite geometric. They seemed to writhe and twist, drawing the eye inward. There was no lock, just a simple, fitted lid that I don't know why, but I had to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact with the wood, a strange sensation shot up my arm, not an electric shock, but a feeling of profound, static-filled silence. It was like putting on noise-canceling headphones in the middle of a concert. For a blissful, fleeting second, the constant, low-grade hum of fear in my mind vanished. There was only the box. "Ah," the old shopkeeper said, suddenly beside me. I hadn't even heard him approach. "That is a curious piece. From the mountains, I think. The carving is not of this region. How much is it?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I couldn't take my eyes off it that he named a price in Corona that was surprisingly low. I paid without haggling, my hands shaking slightly as I took the box. It felt cool and solid, a small anchor in the swirling chaos of my life. I left the shop, the little bell marking my exit, and hurried back towards the hotel, clutching my strange new possession as if it were a holy relic. Back in the hotel room, Chloe was awake. She looked at the box in my hands with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "What is that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I just felt like I had to have it." I sat on the floor and placed the box between us. It had no obvious mechanism to open it. The lid was fitted so perfectly into the base that it was almost seamless. I ran my fingers over the carvings, tracing their complex, hypnotic patterns. As my thumb pressed into a particular deep swirl near the corner, I felt a faint click. A hidden spring. The lid popped up by a millimeter. With bated breath, I lifted the lid. The inside was lined with faded, wine-red velvet. Nestled within were the remnants of a life. The first thing I saw was a photograph, a sepia-toned cabinet card from the early 20th century. It showed a young man, perhaps in his early 20s. He had intense, intelligent eyes, high cheekbones, and dark hair swept back from his forehead. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was calm and thoughtful. He wore a simple, dark suit, but pinned to his lapel was a small, star-shaped flower. Beneath the photo was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The cover was blank. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with an elegant, spidery script in faded brown ink. It was all in Czech. Next to the journal lay a single, pressed flower. It was the same star-shaped flower from the man's lapel, its petals now a fragile, translucent white. An Edelweiss. Pani Savova's words came back to me. From the mountains, the final item was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age, hanging on a delicate chain. It was cold to the touch. I fumbled with the clasp and managed to open it. On one side was a miniature portrait, a painting so tiny it was hard to make out the details, of a woman with sad eyes. The other side was empty, a shallow, hollow space waiting for an image that was no longer there. That I felt a profound sense of melancholy as I looked at these items. This was a life. A person with hopes and secrets, now reduced to a few keepsakes in a carved box sold in a dusty shop. I felt a strange kinship with him, this forgotten man. He was a ghost of a different sort, one trapped not by malice, but by time. That I closed the box, placing it on the nightstand. I didn't know what any of it meant, but for the first time in weeks, the fear was not the only thing I felt. There was curiosity. There was sadness. There was a mystery that had nothing to do with Vondrasek or the collector. That night, my dream was different. There was no chair, no dark room, no Vondrasek with his hollow eyes. That I was standing in a meadow. The grass was impossibly green, dotted with wildflowers of every color. The air was clean and crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. Towering around me were the jagged, snow-capped peaks of mountains that scraped against a brilliant blue sky. It was peaceful. It was beautiful. A figure was walking towards me from across the meadow. It was the young man from the photograph. He wore the same dark suit, and the Edelweiss was still pinned to his lapel. As he drew closer, I saw that his intense eyes were filled not with malice, but with a deep, ancient sadness. "Dobry den," he said, his voice calm and clear, with a faint accent I couldn't place. "You are Liam." I could only nod, speechless. "My name is Jakub," he said, stopping a few feet from me. "Thank you for finding my box. I have been scattered for a very long time." Are you a ghost?" I asked, the question sounding absurd in this sun-drenched paradise. A sad smile touched his lips. "I am a memory. An echo. One of the first to be taken by the Spiritel. Before the walls of that room were so crowded with names. He glanced around the beautiful meadow. This is all I have left of my home. A dream. He cannot take this from me. The collector, I whispered. Vondrasek. The Vondrasek family are merely the keepers, the priests of the ritual, Jakub corrected gently. The thing in that room, the collector, is much older. It is not a ghost. A ghost is the echo of a single soul. The collector is a golem, but not one made of clay and river mud. It is a golem of pain, a creature sculpted from the final moments of stolen lives. It feeds on terror and despair. With each soul it collects, it grows stronger, its echo louder. It was a horrifying, poetic explanation that made a terrible kind of sense. Why are you here? Why are you talking to me? I asked. You broke the cycle, he said, his gaze becoming intense. And you found my memories. The box. It anchors me, gives my echo a voice. I cannot fight him from here. But I can speak to you. I can tell you what I know. Can you tell me how to stop it? I pleaded, a desperate hope blooming in my chest. To kill a golem, you must destroy the Shem, the word of power that gives it life, Jakub said, his voice dropping. But this golem's Shem is not written on parchment and placed in its mouth. Its life force is the room itself, and the pain soaked into its stones. You cannot destroy the room. But you can starve it. He took a step closer, and the beautiful meadow around us seemed to flicker for a moment, the image of the dark, stone-walled room bleeding through at the edges. It feeds on ritual, Jakub whispered urgently. The knocking. The fear. You must break the ritual. But you must do it from within. You cannot just stop. You must give it the one thing it cannot consume, the one thing that is poison to it. What? I begged. What is it? The dream was fading. The mountain peaks were dissolving like smoke, the green grass turning to gray stone. Jakub's face was becoming translucent. It is a collector of endings, he said, his voice echoing as if from a great distance. You must give it a beginning. Find the first name. The first soul. The one he built his temple upon. Find her name, his voice dissolved into the wind, and the meadow vanished. I was plunged back into darkness, with his final, cryptic words echoing in my mind, find her name, chapter 14. I woke with a gasp, the hotel room still dark, the digital clock on the nightstand glowing 3:17 a.m. Chloe stirred beside me, murmuring something unintelligible in her sleep. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't from fear. It was from a frantic, exhilarating sense of purpose. Jakub's words, though fragmented by the fading dream, felt like a map. A way out. Find her name. The first soul. The one he built his temple upon, the journal. Jakub's journal. It was my only lead. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to locate the wooden box on the nightstand. I carefully extracted the leather-bound book, its brittle pages feeling ancient and fragile in my hands. The elegant script, Jakub's confessions and observations, now held the key to my survival. That I spent the rest of the night hunched over the journal, translating its check entries with the help of my phone's dictionary app. It was slow, painstaking work, made more difficult by the archaic language in Jakub's poetic, often metaphorical prose. He wrote of his love for a woman named Alara, musician with eyes like the night sky and a voice that could coax roses from winter stone. He wrote of their shared dreams of a life in the mountains, far from the suffocating confines of Prague, but then the entries shifted. A growing unease seeped into the elegant script. He spoke of a shadow that clung to the old Vondrasek house, a malevolent presence that had begun to whisper her name in the wind. He described strange occurrences, objects moving, cold spots, the feeling of being watched. He documented his desperate attempts to protect Alara, his research into old rituals, his growing certainty that the Vondrasek family, in their pursuit of arcane knowledge, had unwittingly unleashed something terrible, and then, the chilling truth began to emerge. Jakub had discovered the Vondraseks weren't just dabbling in the occult, they were actively cultivating it. They saw the collector not as a curse, but as a source of power, a monstrous entity they could control, or so they believed. The ritual, the knocking, wasn't for protection against the collector, but a feeding ritual, a way to offer up fear and despair, slowly building its strength. The last entry was almost illegible, scrawled in a frantic hand. They took her. Alara. They offered her. The first. Her voice, her beautiful voice, silenced. No, not silenced. Absorbed. To give it a voice. The first note in its dreadful symphony. She is the foundation. The Shem. Her name, it echoes, it breathes. The journal ended there. No more entries. Only a faint, smudged fingerprint on the last page. Chapter 15. The morning light, when it finally crept through the hotel curtains, felt almost alien. Chloe woke to find me still on the floor, surrounded by pages of translated text. I explained everything, the dream, the journal, the horrific revelation about Alara and the true nature of the golem. Chloe listened, her face pale, but her gaze was resolute. The fear hadn't vanished, but a new resolve had replaced it. So, Alara's name is the Shem, Chloe said, her voice quiet but firm. The beginning Jakub spoke of. We have to give it back to the golem. To break the cycle. But how? I asked, frustration rising. How do we give a name back to something that devoured it? Chloe picked up the small silver locket from the box. What about this? It's empty on one side. The miniature portrait is on the other. What if we need to put her name back into it? A cold shiver ran down my spine. The empty locket, the missing image. It was a vessel, waiting to be filled. But how could we, two ordinary people, restore a name devoured by an ancient horror? We need to go back, I said, the word surprising even myself. To the apartment. To the room. It's the only place we can truly confront it. Chloe didn't argue. There was a grim acceptance in her eyes. We both knew this was our last stand. Chapter 16. The walk back to the apartment was surreal. The city, vibrant and bustling, seemed indifferent to the terrifying purpose that propelled us. We entered the building, the familiar scent of old wood and dust a grim welcome. The apartment door was exactly as we had left it, slightly ajar, the light still blazing within. As we stepped inside, the oppressive weight of the golem's presence hit us like a physical blow. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation. The bedroom door, normally a benign barrier, now pulsed with a dark energy. Okay, Chloe whispered, clutching my hand. What do we do? I held up the wooden box, its carvings seeming to subtly glow in the ambient light. Jakub said we have to give it the one thing it cannot consume. A beginning. We walked towards the bedroom door. The familiar terror tried to claw its way back into my throat, but beneath it, a strange calm had settled. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about defiance. I placed the wooden box on the floor directly in front of the door. Then, with trembling hands, I opened the silver locket. On one side, the tiny, sad portrait of the unknown woman. On the other, the empty space. Alara, I whispered, the name feeling sacred on my tongue. Alara Vitkova. As I spoke her full name, a faint, ethereal hum vibrated through the air. The small, pressed Edelweiss flower, still nestled in the box, seemed to shimmer. I picked it up gently, its petals incredibly delicate. This was hers, I said, holding the flower. Her memory. Her essence. Carefully, meticulously, I placed the fragile Edelweiss into the empty side of the locket. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting there for a century. The moment the flower settled into its place, a blinding flash of white light erupted from the locket, so intense it forced us to shield our eyes. A sound, unlike anything I had ever heard, tore through the apartment. It was a guttural, choked roar, followed by a sound like crumbling stone and splintering wood, but without any physical damage. It was the sound of something being unraveled, a voice being silenced not by force, but by erasure. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, suddenly, completely. The air grew lighter, cleaner. The silence that followed was profound, absolute. Slowly, we lowered our hands. The light from the locket had faded, but it still lay open, the tiny Edelweiss resting within. The wooden box was unchanged. The bedroom door stood closed, just as it had always been. Chloe and I looked at each other, our faces etched with disbelief and exhaustion. The terror was gone. The golem was gone. Epilogue. We stayed in the apartment for another hour, moving through the rooms with a hesitant freedom, almost expecting the shadow to reappear, the whispers to return. But there was nothing. Only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the gentle sounds of the city outside. The bedroom felt empty. Not a chilling emptiness, but a simple, unoccupied space that we called Inspector Dvorak. He came within the hour, accompanied by a younger, skeptical officer. We told him everything, from the journal to Alara, to the locket and the Edelweiss. The younger officer rolled his eyes, but Dvorak listened, his expression unreadable. He examined the bedroom. Nothing, he declared, after a thorough, if perfunctory, search. Just a normal room. We pressed him about the Vondrasek family, about the collector.